The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of courtroom 304 as Sarah Jenkins straightened her navy blue blazer. At 32 years old, she stood out among the usual crowd in traffic court. Her professional attire and calm demeanor seemed at odds with the nervous energy that filled the room. Judge Michael Richardson's gavel echoed through the courtroom as he called the next case. Case number 247, Sarah Jenkins. His voice carried the weight of 20 years on the bench. He glanced down at the police report, his gray eyebrows furrowing as he read the details. Sarah stepped forward, her shoulders back and head held high. The wooden floor creaked under her sensible black shoes as she approached the podium. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, but her expression remained composed. "Ms. Jenkins," Judge Richardson began, peering over his reading glasses, "you were found in your vehicle at 2:30 a.m. in one of our city's most troubled neighborhoods. The officer notes suspicious behavior. Would you care to explain yourself?" His tone carried a hint of judgment that made several observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, I was parked on Mason Street because—" "Speak up," the judge interrupted, his patience already wearing thin. The morning had been filled with the usual excuses, and his tolerance for what he assumed would be another story was minimal. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah responded, her voice clearer but still respectful. "I was parked on Mason Street because I received an urgent call." Judge Richardson cut her off again, shuffling through the papers before him. "Ms. Jenkins, this is not the first time you've been spotted in this area late at night. The officer's report indicates a pattern." He looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting her brown ones. "This court sees far too many cases of individuals claiming to have innocent reasons for being in high-crime areas after midnight." The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual whispers and shuffling of papers ceased. The court clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, glanced sympathetically at Sarah. "Your Honor, if you would allow me to explain," Sarah tried again, her hands clasped firmly in front of her. "I work as a—" "Ms. Jenkins," the judge's voice grew sterner. "The facts are clear. You were in a vehicle in a known troubled area well after midnight. Previous warnings have been issued." He removed his glasses, placing them deliberately on his desk. "This court has a responsibility to maintain order and discourage activities that might contribute to the problems in these neighborhoods." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but she maintained her professional composure. The weight of the assumptions being made about her hung heavy in the air. Several other people waiting for their cases watched intently, some with recognition of a familiar scenario playing out before them. A police officer standing by the courtroom door shifted his weight, his eyes moving between the judge and Sarah. Something about her demeanor seemed different from the usual defendants he saw, but he remained silent. "Given the circumstances and your previous warnings," Judge Richardson continued, "this court finds it necessary to impose a fine of $500. He reached for his gavel. "I hope this serves as a lesson about the importance of avoiding suspicious behavior and questionable areas of our city, especially during late hours." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the amount, but she kept her voice steady. "Your Honor, I understand the court's position, but I was there because—" "That will be all, Ms. Jenkins," the judge declared firmly, bringing down his gavel. "Pay the fine within 30 days. Next case." As Sarah turned to leave the podium, she caught glimpses of mixed reactions from the courtroom audience. Some avoided eye contact, while others showed subtle signs of understanding and sympathy. The court clerk quickly looked down at her computer, her fingers hovering motionless over the keyboard. Walking back through the courtroom, Sarah's heels clicked against the floor in a steady rhythm. Her back remained straight, her dignity intact despite the unjust assumptions that had just dictated her fate. As she pushed open the heavy wooden doors to exit, she pulled out her phone. The screen showed 3 missed calls from the youth center where she worked, reminding her that despite this setback, her real work, her life's purpose, was waiting for her. The afternoon sun had turned harsh by the time Sarah Jenkins reached her small office at the Riverside Community Center. Her morning in court had left her with a bitter taste in her mouth and a $500 fine that she couldn't easily afford on a social worker's salary. She placed her bag on her desk and sank into her chair, finally allowing herself a moment to process what had happened. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Marcus, the 16-year-old client she had been helping last night when the police stopped her. "Thanks for being there, Ms. J. I'm feeling better today," the message read. Sarah smiled slightly, knowing that despite the morning's unfair treatment, she had made the right choice in responding to his crisis call. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Linda, her supervisor, stood in the doorway with concern written across her face. "I heard about what happened in court," she said, stepping into the office. "Word travels fast in this building." Sarah straightened in her chair. "Judge Richardson wouldn't even let me explain why I was there," she said, her voice steady but tired. "He just saw what he wanted to see, a black woman in the wrong neighborhood at night." Linda shook her head in disappointment. "The same judge who's supposed to be speaking at the County Welfare Board meeting today. About community engagement?" She let out a short, ironic laugh. "Wait, what?" Sarah sat up straighter. "He's the guest speaker at the meeting where I'm presenting our youth program results." "Yes, and that's actually why I came to find you," Linda replied, leaning against the doorframe. "The meeting starts in an hour. Are you still up for presenting?" Sarah looked at the fine notice on her desk, then at Marcus's message still showing on her phone. A determined expression crossed her face. "Absolutely. More than ever." While gathering her presentation materials, Sarah thought about the teenagers she worked with daily. Many of them faced the same prejudices she had encountered in court: quick judgments, harsh assumptions, and no chance to explain their circumstances. The fine would strain her budget, but it had only strengthened her resolve. At her desk, she opened her laptop to review her presentation one last time. The statistics were impressive: 70% reduction in repeat offenses among at-risk youth in their program, 85% improvement in school attendance, and dozens of testimonials from families whose lives had changed. These numbers represented real people, real stories, and real success. The community center's hallways were busy as Sarah walked to the meeting room, her presentation folder tucked under her arm. Teenagers from the after-school program waved as she passed. "Ms. Jenkins, are you coming to the basketball game tomorrow?" called out Deshawn, one of her regular students. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied with a warm smile, momentarily forgetting her troubles. These small interactions reminded her why she chose this challenging career. The County Welfare Board meeting was being held in the large conference room downtown, just 2 blocks from the courthouse where she had stood earlier that day. As Sarah entered the room, she noticed several familiar faces from various community organizations. Then she saw him, Judge Richardson, sitting near the front, reviewing some papers. He hadn't noticed her yet. Sarah took a seat near the back, watching as more people filed in. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The same judge who had refused to hear her explanation about helping a troubled teen would now have to listen to her speak about exactly that work. Linda found her just before the meeting started. "You're scheduled to present right after the judge's opening remarks," she whispered. "Are you ready?" Sarah nodded, her hand touching the small folder containing Marcus's crisis call log from the previous night, documentation of exactly why she had been in that neighborhood. She hadn't planned to share it, but now she wondered if she should. Sometimes, she thought, the best way to fight prejudice was to shine a light directly on it. As the meeting chairman called everyone to order, Sarah sat quietly, her heart steady and her mind clear. The fine notice might have been in her bag, but so were the success stories of hundreds of young lives she had helped change. In just a few minutes, Judge Richardson would learn exactly who he had dismissed so quickly in his courtroom. The County Welfare Board meeting room buzzed with quiet conversation as Judge Michael Richardson approached the podium. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, ready to deliver his prepared speech about community engagement. His morning in traffic court felt far away now, just another routine day of maintaining order in his city. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his authoritative voice carrying across the room. "As a judge in this community for over 20 years, I've seen firsthand the importance of—" He paused mid-sentence, his eyes landing on a familiar face in the audience. It took him a moment to place her, the woman from traffic court earlier that day. What was she doing at a County Welfare Board meeting? Linda, the program supervisor, noticed his hesitation and followed his gaze to Sarah. A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth, knowing what was about to unfold. Judge Richardson recovered quickly and continued his speech, but his eyes kept drifting back to Sarah Jenkins. She sat perfectly straight, her expression professional and attentive, looking quite different from the defendant he had dismissed so quickly that morning. And now, The chairman announced after the judge's speech. We'll hear from Sarah Jenkins, lead social worker for our youth intervention program. As many of you know, her program has become a model for other counties across the state. The judge's face paled slightly as Sarah stood and walked to the podium. She carried herself with quiet confidence, nodding politely to him as they passed each other. The rustle of papers filled the room as she arranged her presentation materials. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. Over the past 5 years, our youth intervention program has worked with over 1,000 at-risk teenagers in our community's most challenging neighborhoods. Judge Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Sarah clicked to her first slide. It showed a map of the city, with the program's highest success rates highlighted. The very neighborhood where he had fined her for being suspicious was marked as one of their most improved areas. Our social workers are available 24 hours a day, Sarah continued, making brief eye contact with the judge. We believe that crisis intervention can't wait until morning. Just last night, for example, one of our team members responded to an emergency call from a suicidal teen on Mason Street. The judge's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering on the table. A few heads turned at the noise, but Sarah continued smoothly with her presentation. She shared statistics, success stories, and photographs of community events. Each slide revealed more about the extensive work she and her team were doing in the very neighborhoods the judge had warned her to stay away from. Ms. Jenkins, one board member called out during the question period, your dedication is remarkable. Didn't you recently receive the State Social Worker of the Year award? Sarah nodded modestly. Yes, though the real reward is seeing our young people succeed. Many of them just need someone to believe in them, someone who won't judge them based on appearances or assumptions. Judge Richardson's collar felt tight as he watched several board members nodding in agreement. He thought about the harsh fine he had imposed that morning, about how quickly he had dismissed her attempts to explain. The evidence of her real work, her life's work, was now displayed on the screen behind her, impossible to ignore. As Sarah concluded her presentation, the room erupted in applause. Several people stood, impressed by the program's results. The judge remained seated, his mind racing as he recalled his words from that morning. This court sees far too many cases of individuals claiming to have innocent reasons for being in high-crime areas after midnight. Now he knew her reason wasn't just innocent, it was noble. While he had been sleeping soundly in his comfortable suburban home, Sarah Jenkins had been out saving a young person's life, and he had fined her $500 for it. The chairman was making closing remarks, but Judge Richardson barely heard them. He was too busy watching Sarah gather her materials, accepting congratulations from board members, and carrying herself with the same dignity she had shown in his courtroom. Only now he saw her clearly for the first time, and the weight of his morning's prejudice felt heavier than his judicial robes ever had. Back at the Riverside Community Center, Sarah sat in her small office, surrounded by photographs of the hundreds of young lives she had touched over the past decade. Each picture told a story of transformation, of hope found in desperate times. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her degrees hanging on the wall, a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in social work, both earned while working part-time and volunteering at local shelters. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, the teenager she had helped last night. Can we talk, Ms. J? I'm at the center. Sarah immediately replied, come to my office. A few minutes later, a tall, thin boy with tired eyes appeared in her doorway. I saw the police stop you last night, Marcus said quietly, settling into the chair across from her desk. I feel bad that you got in trouble because of me. Sarah leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Marcus, listen to me. I've been doing this work for 10 years, and not once have I regretted answering a late-night call. Your life matters more than any fine. As she spoke with Marcus, Sarah's mind drifted back to her journey. 10 years ago, she had been fresh out of college, eager to make a difference. Her first case had been a teenage girl named Keisha, found sleeping in the park after running away from an abusive home. That night had taught Sarah the importance of being available whenever crisis struck. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Linda stood there with a stack of files. Sorry to interrupt, but the news about your fine is spreading through the center. The kids are organizing a fundraiser to help pay it. Sarah shook her head, smiling despite herself. Tell them to stop. That's not necessary. Marcus sat up straighter. But Ms. J, you got fined for helping me. Let us help you back. The best way you can help me, Sarah replied, is by staying in school and following your treatment plan. That's worth more than any fine. Linda watched the exchange with pride. She remembered hiring Sarah 10 years ago, seeing something special in the young graduate who insisted on working in the city's toughest neighborhoods. Now, Sarah had transformed their youth program into a model of success. The walls of Sarah's office told the story of those years. Certificates of appreciation hung next to thank you cards from families. A local newspaper article praised her innovative approach to youth intervention. Social worker builds bridge between troubled youth and hope, the headline read. You know, Linda said, settling into another chair, I remember your first year here. You used to sleep on that old couch in the corner, worried you might miss an emergency call. Marcus looked at the worn-out couch with new understanding. You really stayed here overnight? Sarah nodded. Sometimes. Back then, we didn't have the 24-hour crisis line. It was just me and my cell phone. She pulled out an old photo from her desk drawer. Look at this, my first group of kids. 7 of them are in college now. The photo showed a younger Sarah surrounded by teenagers, all wearing community center t-shirts. Their smiles were tentative, unsure, but their eyes held hope. Today, those same kids had become success stories, breaking cycles of poverty and violence. That judge, Marcus said suddenly, he didn't know any of this when he fined you, did he? No, Sarah replied softly. But that's why our work is so important. We have to keep showing up, keep proving that people are more than first impressions and quick judgments. Linda nodded toward the window, where the afternoon light illuminated the playground outside. Dozens of kids played basketball, did homework, or just hung out in a safe space. Every one of them has a story, she said. And every one of them knows they can call Sarah Jenkins at 2:30 in the morning if they need help. Sarah looked at her phone, at the fine notice still visible on the screen, then at Marcus's hopeful face. In 10 years, she had answered hundreds of late-night calls, driven through countless troubled neighborhoods, and faced numerous suspicious police officers. But she had also saved lives, changed futures, and built a program that worked. No fine could change that truth. Judge Michael Richardson sat alone in his chambers late that evening, his tie loosened and his judicial robe hanging forgotten on its hook. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind as he reviewed case files from the past month. Each manila folder represented a person he had judged, often within minutes of them entering his courtroom. The image of Sarah Jenkins' presentation at the welfare board meeting kept replaying in his head. He pulled out her case file from that morning and opened it, studying the police report with new eyes. Suspicious vehicle parked on Mason Street at 2:30 a.m., it read. Now he knew she had been there saving a young person's life. His computer screen glowed with Sarah's professional profile, which he had looked up after the meeting. State Social Worker of the Year, master's degree with honors, creator of an internationally recognized youth intervention program, and he had treated her like a common criminal. Your Honor. His clerk, Mrs. Thompson, appeared at the door. It's past 7. Are you still going through old cases? The judge nodded, gesturing to the stack of files before him. Margaret, how many times have I rushed to judgment in cases like Ms. Jenkins? How many people did I silence before hearing their full story? Mrs. Thompson entered the office quietly, her experience of 30 years as a court clerk evident in her thoughtful expression. I remember trying to tell you about Ms. Jenkins this morning. She's helped several of my neighbors' children. The judge pushed back from his desk, running his hands through his gray hair. I didn't even let her finish a single sentence. I was so sure I knew what kind of person she was the moment she walked in. He stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. Mason Street was visible in the distance, where Sarah had parked her car last night. From his comfortable chambers, that neighborhood had always seemed like another world. But Sarah Jenkins worked there every day, choosing to help rather than judge. I found something else you should see, Mrs. Thompson said, placing a newspaper clipping on his desk. It was an article from 3 months ago about the youth intervention program. There was Sarah, surrounded by smiling teenagers, in the same neighborhood he had told her to avoid. The judge picked up the article, reading about how the program had reduced youth crime rates by 60% in the most troubled areas of the city. The same areas he dealt with in court every day. How many of the young people in his courtroom could have benefited from meeting Sarah Jenkins before they met him? His eyes fell on the fine receipt he had issued that morning. $500 for being a dedicated social worker, for doing the kind of work that actually made his job easier by preventing crime rather than just punishing it. "Margaret," he said quietly, "do you remember that sensitivity training program the court system tried to implement last year?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "The one most judges opted out of." "Yes, I was one of them." He sat back down heavily in his chair. "I thought 20 years on the bench had taught me everything I needed to know about judgment. Today proved me wrong." He began making notes on a legal pad, his writing becoming more determined with each line. Ideas for changing court procedures, requiring more context before making judgments, creating partnerships with social workers like Sarah. "Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson said gently, "what are you planning?" The judge looked up, his face showing both regret and resolve. "First, I need to make things right with Ms. Jenkins. Then, we need to make changes in how this court operates. Real changes." He gestured to the stacks of case files. "How many other Sarah Jenkinses have walked through our courtroom, only to be silenced and dismissed?" As the night deepened outside his window, Judge Richardson continued writing, his pen moving steadily across the paper. 20 years of assumptions and quick judgments had been shaken in a single day. Now the real work of change needed to begin. The next morning, Sarah Jenkins arrived at her office to find an unexpected message from the court. Judge Richardson had requested a meeting with her that afternoon. She read the message twice, unsure what to make of it. "You don't have to go," Linda said when Sarah showed her the message. They were standing in the community center's busy hallway, where the sounds of basketball practice echoed from the gym. "After how he treated you yesterday." Sarah shook her head. "No, I think I should hear what he has to say." She checked her watch. "The meeting's at 2. That gives me time to finish my morning sessions first." At exactly 2 o'clock, Sarah walked into the courthouse. It felt different from yesterday, less intimidating now that she was here by invitation rather than summons. The security guard recognized her and smiled warmly. "Ms. Jenkins, thank you for what you do for our kids," he said quietly as she passed through security. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, was waiting to escort her to the judge's chambers. "He's been different since yesterday," she whispered as they walked. "Been here since dawn, reviewing old cases." The judge's office was larger than Sarah expected, with walls lined with law books and windows overlooking the city. Judge Richardson stood as she entered, his usual stern expression replaced by something that looked like humility. "Ms. Jenkins," he began, then corrected himself. "Sarah, please have a seat." He gestured to a chair across from his desk, then surprised her by moving to sit in the chair next to it rather than behind his desk. "I owe you an apology," he said directly, his voice softer than it had been in court. "What I did yesterday morning was wrong on many levels." Sarah sat quietly, studying the man who had fined her without a second thought just yesterday. He looked older today, more tired, as if he had spent the night wrestling with difficult truths. "I've spent the last 24 hours reviewing cases," he continued, pointing to a stack of files on his desk. "Cases where I might have made the same mistake, judging someone without knowing their full story." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I let my prejudices affect my judgment." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Your Honor." "Please call me Michael," he interrupted, but gently this time, "at least in this conversation." "Michael," Sarah said, testing the name. "Your apology means a lot. But this isn't just about me. Every day, people walk into your courtroom who have stories that need to be heard." The judge nodded, reaching for a document on his desk. "That's partly why I asked you here. First, I voided your fine. But more importantly, I want to talk about changes we can make in how this court operates." He handed her the document, a proposal for a new court program that would partner with social workers to provide context in cases involving at-risk youth and their families. "Would you be willing to help develop this program?" he asked. "Your experience, your insights, they could help prevent other judges from making the same mistakes I made." Sarah read through the proposal carefully. "This could make a real difference," she said thoughtfully. "But it would need to be more than just a paper program. Real change requires real commitment." "I know," the judge replied. "That's why I'm starting with myself." He stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city they both served in different ways. "Yesterday, You showed me that justice without understanding isn't really justice at all." Sarah joined him at the window. From this height, they could see both the courthouse and the community center, the two worlds that had collided in his courtroom yesterday. "I'll help," she said finally. "Not because of your apology, but because this could help the kids I work with. They need people in positions of power to see them as more than just their circumstances." Judge Richardson turned to face her, extending his hand. "Thank you, Sarah. Yesterday you taught this old judge a lesson he should have learned long ago. Today, let's start working on making sure it wasn't learned in vain." 3 months after their meeting in the judge's chambers, Sarah Jenkins and Judge Richardson sat together in the courthouse conference room, surrounded by social workers, court officials, and community leaders. The room buzzed with energy as they prepared to launch their new program, Justice Through Understanding. "6 new social workers have joined our team," Sarah explained to the group, pointing to a presentation slide. "They'll work directly with the court to provide background information on cases involving at-risk youth and their families." She glanced at Judge Richardson, who nodded encouragingly. The judge stood up next, looking more approachable in his suit than he ever had in his judicial robes. "When Ms. Jenkins first came into my courtroom, I made judgments based on assumptions. Today, we're changing that system." The local newspaper reporter in the back of the room took notes quickly. The story of the judge and the social worker had already spread through the community, becoming a symbol of how change could happen when people were willing to learn from their mistakes. Marcus, the teenager whose late-night crisis had started it all, sat in the front row. Now a peer counselor in training, he watched proudly as Sarah described how the program would work. "Every person who comes before the court has a story," she said. "Our job is to make sure that story is heard." Linda leaned over to whisper to Marcus, "Remember when she got fined for helping you? Look at what came from that." The new program had already begun showing results. In its first month of testing, cases involving young offenders had seen a 40% increase in referrals to support services instead of punitive measures. Judge Richardson had become its strongest advocate, speaking to other judges about the importance of understanding context before making decisions. "We've created a 24-hour consultation line," Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide. "Now, when cases come up late at night or on weekends, judges can reach a social worker for immediate context." She smiled slightly. "No more fines for being in the wrong neighborhood at the right time." The audience chuckled. The message was serious. The partnership between the court and social workers was changing how justice worked in their community. Other counties had already reached out, wanting to learn more about the program. After the presentation, Judge Richardson shared some surprising statistics. "In reviewing my past cases," he admitted, "I found clear patterns of bias in my decisions. But in the 3 months since we started this program, the number of repeat offenders in my court has dropped by 30%. Sarah added her own observations. "The young people we work with are starting to see the court system differently. They feel heard, understood. That makes them more likely to trust the process and work toward positive change." The questions from the audience showed how much interest the program had generated. A judge from a neighboring county asked about implementation costs. A social worker wanted to know about training requirements. Even the police department had sent representatives to learn more. As the meeting wound down, Marcus approached the front of the room. "Ms. J," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "can I tell them my story?" Sarah looked at Judge Richardson, who nodded. Marcus turned to face the crowd. 3 months ago, I was ready to give up," he began. "I called Ms. Jenkins at 2:30 in the morning because I didn't think I had a future. She came to help me and got fined for it." He paused, looking at the judge. "But instead of getting angry, she and Judge Richardson turned it into something that's helping kids like me." The room fell silent as Marcus spoke. His words carried the weight of real experience, showing exactly why the program was needed. After the meeting, Sarah and Judge Richardson stood in the courthouse lobby, looking at the new Justice Through Understanding banner hanging above the entrance. "You know," the judge said thoughtfully, "sometimes the best view of justice comes from both sides of the bench." Sarah nodded, watching as people filed out of the building. "And sometimes," she added, "the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of understanding." 1 year had passed since the day Sarah Jenkins stood in Judge Richardson's courtroom. The autumn sun streamed through the windows of the newly renamed Community Justice Center, where a large group had gathered for the first anniversary celebration of the Justice Through Understanding program. Sarah stood at the podium, looking out at faces both familiar and new. The program had grown beyond anything they had initially imagined. 25 social workers now worked with the courts, and similar programs had started in 12 other counties across the state. A year ago, Sarah began, I stood in this building as a defendant. Today, I stand here as a partner in justice. She gestured to Judge Richardson, who sat in the front row without his judicial robes, choosing instead to wear a business suit for this community event. The statistics displayed on the screen behind her told a powerful story. Youth recidivism rates had dropped by 65%, emergency response times for crisis situations had improved by 80%, but the real success could be seen in the faces of the young people sitting in the audience. Marcus, now a full-time youth counselor, sat with a group of teenagers he mentored. Next to them were 3 judges who had once been skeptical of the program, but now were its strongest supporters. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had witnessed it all, wiped away a tear as she took notes. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Sarah continued. Real change happens one person at a time. She pointed to a wall covered with photographs, dozens of success stories from the past year. Each of these faces represents someone who was given a chance to be understood before being judged. Judge Richardson took his turn at the podium. A year ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like, he said, his voice carrying emotion. I was wrong. Justice without understanding is just punishment. True justice requires us to see the whole person, the whole story. He shared how the program had changed his own approach to justice. No more rush to judgment. No more assumptions based on appearance or circumstance. Every case now began with a simple question: tell me your story. The local news cameras rolled as Linda stepped up to share another surprise. The state legislature had just approved funding to expand the program statewide. Sarah's original find of $500 had led to $1 million investment in community justice. But the real investment, Linda said, is in people. She revealed a new scholarship program, named after Sarah, that would help young people from troubled neighborhoods pursue careers in social work and law. Marcus stood up next, no longer the troubled teen from a year ago. Ms. Jenkins taught us that everyone deserves to be heard, he said. And Judge Richardson showed us that it's never too late to learn and change. The ceremony ended with a special moment. Judge Richardson formally expunged Sarah's year-old fine from the record, but Sarah stopped him before he could complete the paperwork. Keep it in the record, she said, surprising everyone. But add a note to it. Let it show how one mistake, acknowledged and corrected, can lead to positive change. The judge nodded, understanding. Together, they had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. The fine would remain in the record, not as a mark against Sarah, but as a reminder of how far they had come. As the celebration continued, Sarah walked through the crowd, stopping to talk with young people, judges, and social workers. Each conversation represented a bridge built, a connection made, a life potentially changed. Outside the building, the old sign reading Municipal Court had been replaced. The new one read, Community Justice Center, where understanding meets justice. Below it, in smaller letters, was the program's motto, Every Story Matters. Judge Richardson joined Sarah outside, both of them looking up at the new sign. You know, he said, that fine was the most expensive mistake I ever made, and the best investment this court system ever had. Sarah smiled, watching as a group of teenagers walked confidently into the building, no longer afraid of the justice system. Sometimes, she replied, the price of learning is high, but the cost of not learning is much higher. Together, they walked back into the building they had transformed, ready to write the next chapter in their story of justice through understanding.